Hey folks, while I don't often talk about it, I do play a lot of indie card games, and then pester my Discord buddies about them. Maybe it's because they work fairly well as something to do in between reviews, or when I have trouble sleeping, or just because I'm a little bit obsessive. That said, given I invest so much time into them, I figured I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about my latest deck building dalliance, specifically Nerdook Productions' roguelite card game, Monster Slayers. And the Fire and Steel expansion, since I got that from the outset. Join me as I journey through its monster-ravaged realms and discover if I thought Monster Slayers was a solid slice of card-based fun, or if it was more of a misadventure. I'm your host, Arlyeon. Let's find out together. Faced with the potential awakening of an ancient evil known as the Harbinger, the local Adventurers Guild finds itself hard-pressed to confront the threat, so they toss up a now hiring sign. That's right! You get to be the legendary hero to save the day. Or not, but if you die, there's certainly a slew of replacements. And, really, that's about it plot-wise, because once you've seen the initial intro, there's really not much else to the story. I mean, there is some flavor text in the journal, but yeah. Monster Slayer's primary concern is that you get on task and body some baddies, and it wastes no time in letting you do just that. Each game session starts you with taking one of the game's myriad classes, with 6 base, 6 advanced ones you unlock from the base, and another 2 DLC classes beside, and then sets you loose in the world. I mean, it's not a broad world, but you do have a selection of regions you can choose between, and the difference is meaningful since their associated enemies and bosses can be a nightmare for certain classes. Especially since each dungeon gets bigger and badder the further you go in, for the third and final being fairly lengthy to clear out. And I do mean dungeons here, since you have an entire grid of rooms you're free to explore, so you can grind enemies, find resources and items, and pray for helpful events or shops. Honestly, there's literally nothing stopping you from clearing out as much or as little of a floor once you've found and beaten the boss, since you're given the option to linger and finish clearing the rooms or to move on immediately, which is nice. I mean, it can be daunting to stay given your healing options are fairly limited, especially early on, with leveling or clerics being your most stable source. But I generally find the risk warranted. The equipment you find, for instance, provides some subtle but potentially powerful options like offsetting card costs, bonus damage, and even damage resistance or elemental resistance. And there's certainly something to be said if you can find good cards for your deck, though you need to be especially careful about that in this. That said, perhaps the most notable reason to linger is to look out for campfires, instructors, and obelisks. Campfires being the least on the list since it's essentially gambling. Like, yes, it does provide a full heal and potentially stat boost relevant to the items you stick in your soup and even removing a card from your deck. But only if you don't pull a fishbone, since then it gives you nothing. And it can entirely give you a fishbone for the first ingredient you're obliged to pick. Instructors, at least, are always positive. They offer either a card upgrade or AP, a combat resource needed to play some cards, with the latter reward scaling up the further into the dungeon you go. That said, it's the obelisks, I think, which represent the most important spot in each floor, beyond the boss, and that's because they provide you tangible rewards as well as intel, since each obelisk lets you know a specific property about the Harbinger for this run. That's right, the last boss of Monster Slayers is randomized in certain senses, with specific immunities, special abilities, and the types of card he plays changing between runs. I mean, I suppose they're not always immunities. He can sometimes get physical resistance, which I'm glad it's only a resistance, but it still absolutely sucks for a number of characters who are very much limited to that. Obelisks aren't just info dumps, though, as they do provide a one-time mixed blessing per run. Things like upgrading a set of cards in exchange for adding junk cards to your deck, healing when you grab cards in exchange for bleeding every round, and so on and so forth. And once you've gotten that buff, obelisks on future floors instead offer you potent options like the ability to thin out cards in your deck or upgrade them. Services which you can do at merchants, but which get extremely costly fast. It helps though, given that combat in Monster Slayers can be a bit persnickety. Part of this is simply because you have some pretty limited options initially. When you first start off, you're only able to draw 3 cards per turn, and you're limited by low MP and low AP, so you need to be very cautious about the cost of cards in your deck and not upgrading them to the point of creating dead hands. You do naturally gain MP through leveling in some events, but since rewards from leveling are random, and this includes AP that you can acquire as are dungeon rooms, you can get some incredibly crummy runs. Thankfully, your draw limit does go up at level 5 and 10. 15's max, but no such luck at getting another extra card to your hand then. But even at that, I didn't find that it was enough on its own. I was very much fond of favoring cards that provided extra card draws and comboed, especially as it got later into the game. Now, there's a few reasons of this. For one, the enemy doesn't have fixed attack patterns. Like you, they have a deck they're drawing from, which means there's a lot of RNGs that can happen in fights that you let drag out, such as an enemy becoming repeatedly invulnerable back-to-back turns. Secondly, while you aren't able to cycle cards infinitely, there isn't a penalty for exhausting your draw deck. Thirdly, things can just do absurd damage in combos. Wraith enemies, for instance, are entirely capable of just one-shotting you if you can't reliably ignore physical resistance, since they occasionally pop out a super attack that ignores your defense and happens to make them physically immune so they can set themselves up to do it again. So it really just behooves you to be able to dump an entire deck's worth of damage on something every turn. Which was sort of an issue, really, since the game seems to be built around you doing just that, and if you're playing a class that can't reliably do so, you'll frequently hit roadblocks, like when you get an incredibly tanky version of the Harbinger, which is also emptying cards out of your deck. It gets even worse, though, when you wander into Legendary mode. See, once you've beaten the game once, you get access to Legendary mode, which is the game's hard mode. Equipment no longer provides health boosts, enemies are stronger and gain new attacks, and most importantly, there is a true final boss. Conceptually, it's very neat because you get to fight your fallen hero. In practice, this is excruciating since it'll wield one of the decks you've used in the game, which in my case included a very chonky thief deck that emptied the entirety of itself into me every turn, and also a wizard deck I made with 3 time stop spells in it so I could give myself 4 back-to-back turns. Yeah, that feels really fucking bad when an NPC has that. Honestly, if you can get past either of these fights, the post-game arena mode will actually feel a bit relaxing comparatively, since it just throws you into endless consecutive fights against indefinitely scaling enemies. I mean, it is a neat way to sort of flex your deck and compare its efficacy to other players, though I'll admit that I'm less keen on the fact that every third fight, enemies get to go first and wreck your face before you get a turn. Still, there is stuff that makes things easier. Monster Slayers is a roguelite, as I mentioned, so for one thing, you accrue fame as you progress through your adventures, and this is whether you succeed or fail, though obviously victory provides you more, as does going through the arena, but essentially, as you gain higher levels of fame, you accrue perk points, and you can use these to make your various runs smoother. You can get perks like getting an extra try on stages whenever you clear a boss, having more health when you start, when you level up, unlocking the appearance of certain cards, and the ability to find items and potions off random enemies. You also get more focused perks that help to give the classes more distinct identities, and with all of them having a pair of perk tiers with mutually exclusive upgrades you get to choose between to finally tailor it. That and an ultimate tier that unlocks new cards. Like, it helps, but you can expect to grind a bit as you dabble between characters because this is the only way to get the best cards for each class. And yes, while you can reset your perk tree, you can only do that once per save file, which is sorta lame. But also, same limitation for your companions, by the way, which, yeah, that's a thing. You have companions. They're basically one of 2 random NPCs you get to pick at the start of the first 2 dungeons, and you get to name them too. Now, while they are sort of underwhelming on their own, at least at first, once you get the perks associated with them, they get some powerful, albeit limited, abilities and a passive boost. Like, we're talking about things like giving yourself an extra turn, albeit drawing 2 less cards, or just happening to give yourself a massive shield when you want. They're neat options. They're also the subject of a bit of jank. I mean, not just them, but we'll kick things off with armor. This is one of the best status buffs in the game, as it reduces all damage by a certain amount, and normally it's a rare affix on armor. Now, some characters can also get this as a rare perk, which is really nice because it does stack, but it also comes on the Paladin Companion. That's right, you can get up to 3 points of armor if you stack it correctly, for a little bit. Because for some reason, it will actually drop itself down to 1, and once it's dropped itself down to 1, you can't raise it back to 3. It doesn't matter if you're wearing a piece of armor that gives you an armor and you're on a class that gives itself armor, you will be stuck at 1, and this sucks a lot. And this weirdness with stats adding up isn't just limited to the Paladin character. It also happened to be with the Ranger and the Thief Companion, which should have been 25% crit because the Ranger's base 15% was just 15%. Doesn't matter, the Thief's supposed to give you 10%. It just sort of drops off after a point and never comes back, and I hate it. It's galling. Though not as much as needing to quit the shop after every item purchase, because yes, if you somehow have enough gold to purchase multiple items at once, it'll only offer you the ability to equip the most recent purchase, which is super stupid and a giant waste of resources. Also, there's combat jank. Admittedly, this is a lot more uncommon for me, and seems to be tied to a specific card. I'm mostly calling out the Chakram card, which is just, it's an awesome card that does damage and causes you to draw, except for some reason it just misses. It'll just not affect the enemy, not do any damage, and this sucks. Angry. Still, that actually is, I think, more or less the sum of my gripes, and I don't have any when it comes to the game's visuals. Like, the overall aesthetics of the game is fairly cute to me, and I found it sort of neat and cutesy that you can customize your adventure between each run, and each archetype does look different. Pointless, because I was just sort of tossing them into a meat grinder and hoping they'd come out the other end, but yeah, no, a little neat. The audio isn't bad either, like, works well enough as a backdrop for your adventure, though I may have put the game on mute at the 30-odd hours worth of playtime mark, maybe a bit earlier, because there wasn't a huge amount of variety and it was starting to drive me really crazy. It's alright. The music in Monster Slayers is alright. But yeah, I mean, I really have played a lot of this game. 39 hours, in fact, as of writing this review. Partly because Legendary Mode is just brutal, and yet, well, here's the thing. I have a weird sort of affection for the game. There's a number of interesting ideas in Monster Slayers, and it was a lot of fun to find new and different ways to break the game and win. And yet, the overall game balance did seem fairly slanted towards certain character archetypes and play styles, especially as I got into Legendary Mode. Between that and the more notable elements of jank, I have to admit this doesn't feel anywhere near as polished as some of the other deck builders I've played, both on my downtime and for this channel. Not to the extent that I'd pan it, but this was definitely more of a fumble in my books. Still fun, I'll give you that, but ultimately quite finicky. Something you might poke into more casually, but doesn't hold the same sort of lasting power Monster Train, Slay the Spire, or Night of the Full Moon did for me. There's just something very iterative about the way that things went, and increasingly grindy between those runs. But anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and for people wanting to support me and my editors, there's a Patreon, link also in the description too. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you folks on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.